back. Today we're going to continue our look into the Cold War with section 4 of this discussion. And we're going to talk about how really the Cold War was fought in, of course, multiple ways. And we're going to learn about some of those different entities that made up the Cold War. We're going to talk about the Third World quite a bit. During this time, according to the West, there was more than one world. The First World were the capitalists, the industrialized nations such as the United States, and of course its allies in the West. The Second World, according to the Western powers, were the communist nations such as the Soviets and their allies. China would be included there. And then the Third World were developing nations, often newly independent countries, usually ones that were not aligned with other major powers. We'll talk about some of those Cold War strategies that we took a look at here at the start. The United States, the Soviet Union, and China were really in competition during the Cold War time period for influence over some of those third world countries. They would support revolutions, they would provide economic, military, and of course technical aid to some of those smaller burgeoning countries. Next is an association of the non-aligned nations. Many of these countries, like India, they wanted to avoid involvement in the Cold War. In 1955, Indonesia hosted Asian and African leaders that wanted neutrality. And what ended up happening is there was kind of a agreement of non-aligned nations. These were independent countries that were not going to be involved in the issues of the Cold War. Now, there's a couple of very important charts that the textbook goes over, so let's take a look at those together here. We're going to go into depth on these charts as they are important to your understanding of the Cold War. The first one is going to talk about how the Cold War was fought. It talks about what countries were aligned in NATO. We've learned about that. What countries were in the Warsaw Pact. That's in the yellow, the communist nations for the most part. And then the green are some of those non-aligned countries like we had mentioned here just a moment ago. But there are several strategies that were used in the Cold War, especially by big powers like the United States and the Soviets. One strategy, you could help countries out with foreign aid. So superpowers would try to win allies by giving them financial aid. For example, Egypt took aid from the Soviets to build a major dam. And then they're going to be allies a little bit based on finance. You've got espionage. We know about the U-2 incident in which the United States was flying spy planes over Russia and one got shot down. So espionage, spies, all of those kind of Hollywood movie kind of things were going on during the Cold War. Multinational alliances is another one. And to gain the support of other nations, big countries like the Soviets and the United States would enter into big alliances. NATO, Warsaw Pact are two very big examples. Propaganda is something that went on during the Cold War. All of the superpowers, both of the superpowers, would use propaganda to try and make their opponent look bad and gain, political sway toward their ideologies. Brinkmanship is one that we've been learning about all chapter. It's the policy of where you'll go to the brink of war to try and get the other one to back down. One example was the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then you've got the surrogate wars. This one is actually really a big part of the Cold War time period. The word surrogate actually means substitute. And so although the United States and the Soviets weren't actually fighting or sending troops directly, they fought indirectly in some of these other wars by taking the side or backing different groups in smaller conflicts, like the war in Korea, the war in Vietnam, that we've learned about in previous sections of this chapter. Also, there's an important map on 984, which is entitled Hotspots of the Cold War. So you've got Cold War hotspots, meaning areas of the Cold War, there was a lot of activity. So this one would be extremely important. You can see that it's pretty much dominated by Russia, Asia, China, a little bit in the Middle East here. You can see a couple spots, Africa, and then Latin America also had some spots where we saw a little bit more intense conflict during the Cold War period. Okay, next we'll go to Roman numeral 2. We'll come over to Latin America and we'll talk about Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution. Fidel Castro led a revolt in Cuba against a dictator named Fulgencio Batista, who was receiving support from the United States. By 1959, Castro had taken power. He had nationalized the Cuban economy and actually took over some U.S. property there. What he did take over were U.S. sugar mills and refineries. And so, in response to that, the United States began an embargo on all trade with Cuba. And then the Cubans began to trade with the Soviets. And so that's how Cuba and the Soviets became buddy-buddy through communism and trade. In 1961, Castro actually defeated a United States trained army of Cuban exiles at the Bay of Pigs. It's a famous event of the Cold War between Cuba, Soviets, and the United States. Then there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, a nuclear face-off. In 1962, the United States demanded the removal of Soviet missiles that were stationed and pointed directly at our homeland on Cuba. The Soviets eventually removed those missiles, and the United States promised not to invade Cuba. But the Cuban economy was left dependent on only Soviet support. And this is one of the factors here that we took a look at in that chart on page 983. Next, we'll go to capital C. We'll talk about civil war in Nicaragua. Nicaragua was a famous spot where you might have played a game maybe when you're growing up on the original Nintendo. Actually, you guys probably might not have played that game. I played the game. It was called Contras, and it's kind of related to this situation here. Anastasio Somoza was a Nicaraguan dictator that was supported by the United States. And then you had a guy named Daniel Ortega who led a group called the Sandinista rebels who eventually took power in Nicaragua. The United States and the Soviet Union both initially supported the Sandinistas. The Sandinistas aided communist rebels in El Salvador as well. And so therefore, the United States helped the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua to assist El Salvador. In 1990, Nicaragua eventually held its first free elections, and the Sandinistas lost. So that was an example of, espionage, surrogate warfare, so on and so forth. Roman numeral number 3, we'll talk about confrontations in the Middle East. Religious and secular values clashed in Iran. Shah Reza Pahlavi embraced Western governments and also oil companies. Iranian nationalists, they were not happy about this. They overthrew the Shah and they took over the British oil company. The United States restored the Shah to power to avoid the Soviets moving into Iran and encroaching there. So you can see that a lot's going on with these countries, but the US and the Soviets are almost constantly involved in a lot of these decisions. The United States supports the secular role with Shah Reza Pahlavi westernizing Iran under United States aid and support. And then though you have the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, is an Iranian Muslim leader that was living in exile in 1978. The Ayatollah sparked riots in Iran, which caused the Shah to flee. And then the Ayatollah took control, making Iran an Islamic state, and utilized a militant form of rule. Now, the Ayatollah was pretty much anti-United States. Islamic revolutionaries held actually American hostages in the city of Tehran from 1979 to 1980 by taking over the U.S. embassy. Muslim radicals took control of Iran, then increasing tensions with their neighboring country of Iraq. Iran and Iraq fought an 8-year war until the United Nations was able to negotiate a ceasefire in 1988. The aftermath of these type of confrontations eventually lead to the war in the Middle East that the United States got involved with in the 1990s. Next is capital letter D. The superpowers face off again in Afghanistan. The Soviets actually invaded Afghanistan and helped the communist government there against rebels. Muslim rebels fought a guerrilla war against the Soviets using United States weapons. The United States eventually stopped grain shipments to the Soviet Union, and then the Soviets eventually withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989. This was a time period in which the Soviets were very much on the decline, and they really were reliant on United States grain shipments. And so when they took that out of the picture, I think it was a pretty big situation for the Soviets, and that's why they had to withdraw in that major surrogate war there. Okay, that is the end of section 4. There's one wrap-up section on the Cold War, which is going to be section 5.